Hey guys, it's Raychich. I finally finished the starter version of my giga strong and simple trigger build in Path of Exile 2 and I'm ready to share it with you. Let's start with the build's name. It's quite long but still catchy. I name it Fireball, Frostball, Elemental Storm, Custom Freeze Crit Stormweaver. Yeah, it's a lot of words, but there's a lot of meaning too. In this build, my character is level 68 at the moment, and as I continue leveling, I'll be updating the build and making new videos. So, I'll also be answering your comments. Don't be afraid to spend some gold on respects, because everything's gonna be fine. And let me briefly explain how the build works. So, be ready, don't forget to subscribe, like, and we start. In simple words, when running maps with this build or bossing, we cast Frostball on enemies, chilling and freezing them in place, then we cast Fireball into the same area, releasing a large number of projectiles, a lot of these projectiles, and don't be afraid because of Fireball tag, it's not fire. We use blue flame bracers glows in this build, and these glows gives 100% fire to cold conversion, so Fireball is a cold skill now and also can freeze. So Frostball destroys, dealing massive area damage, and each projectile ricochets and continues to deal damage, creating massive area coverage for clearing monsters. Actually, this build is a little bit similar to Garata build, but he plays as a Blood Mage ascendancy, so also he uses crits, but in my build we use crits for actually Elemental Storm, and it's crazy just. So when our two custom freeze gems are charged, they spawn two big comets that deal massive damage. Additionally, even at level 69, this build already has a decent critical strike chance. Every time we deal critical damage, Elemental Storms spawn, dealing cold damage while also slowing and freezing enemies, and when you have completed 3 ascendancy trials, you will spawn this Elemental Storm every 1 second, and there will be a lot of damage in the boss fights. There can be like 5 or 6 Elemental Storms damaging the boss in the same time, so yeah. Let's talk about what matters most on this skill tree in this build. And first is cold damage, freeze build-up, critical chance, mana regeneration, and a bit of cold exposure and trigger spell damage amplification. Let's break each of these down. I think cold damage is obvious here, it's our main damage source, so the more cold damage you have, the better. About freeze build-up, here's how it works. If you don't know, when we apply the chill element to enemies, which we do with any of our abilities because it's cold, it adds a freeze percentage to them. Once this reaches 100%, the enemy freezes. And the freeze threshold varies between normal, magic, rare, and unique enemies. The more freeze build-up you have in your build, the faster you hit that 100% and the faster you will freeze the enemy actually. This ties directly into the custom freeze support gems, which cast Comets, and we use 2 of them in this build, and custom freeze skill trigger linked spells, as for this build is Comet, when enough energy is generated, which happens every time we freeze enemies. So for beginners this might sound complicated, but again, in simple terms, the more enemies you freeze, the more often your custom freeze skills trigger. So since we use 2, and they charge and cast separately, adding consistent extra damage. A few days ago, Granny Gear Games actually nerfed all custom something skill gems, making them weaker than before, but however this build remains strong because we use custom freeze only as an additional damage source, particularly against bosses, so our primary damage source is fine. But don't forget that each comet which triggers because of custom freeze uses a lot of mana, so that's why we need a lot of mana regeneration in this build, and yeah, I will talk about this a bit later. Next is crit mechanic. Critical chance is very important for frequently triggering the Elemental Storm spell from the Stormweaver ascendancy and just for bonus damage because of our spells. Elemental Storm creates small cyclones that deal cold damage over several seconds, freezing enemies and applying additional hinder debuff which slows them. So I love Elemental Storm mechanic and it synergizes perfectly with this build. Initially Elemental Storm has 5-second cooldown, however with a few adjustments I've reduced this cooldown to just 1 second, and this allows the storms to spawn every second, every your crit, every second, 1 second cooldown, and these storms last approximately 7 seconds and significantly boost both monster clearing and boss damage. First, after selecting the Constant Gale and Tempest Callers passives in the Ascendancy, I added Rain Dancer, which gives Elemental Storm 150% more cooldown recovery rate, and this reduces the cooldown to 2 seconds, right? The Crest of Ardor unique shield, which I use in this build adds around 40% increased cooldown recovery rate as well, and improves our mana regeneration, essential for this build, as Elemental Storm and the cast on Freeze skill consume a lot of mana, so it's really perfect choice. Finally, using the Ingenuity support gem, I really hope I pronounced this word right, grants an additional 30% increased cooldown recovery rate, bringing the total cooldown recovery modifier for Elemental Storm to 335%. So super easy, right? So these Elemental Storms, combined with the Comets triggered by the 2 cast on Freeze skill gems, cover large areas on the map, adding significant damage to our core skill setup of Frost Wall and Fireball, and this makes clearing maps smooth and effortless. When fighting bosses, the playstyle remains mostly the same, with one exception. Before engaging the boss, we use Solar Orb, I mean, it's not fire anymore because of glows, it's cold, to inflict cold exposure on critical hits, reducing the boss cold resistance, and apply the hypothermia covers to reduce their resistances, I mean cold. Afterward, we start spawning frost walls and detonating them with fireballs. The boss will be consistently frozen, with comets frequently hitting and multiple elemental storms damaging and slowing them. So it can be like 5, 6 or 7 elemental storms in the same time in one location. This rotation works seamlessly as long as you maintain high mana regeneration, which is a key factor in this build, and mana regeneration is achieved through several sources here. The first one is passive skill tree nodes. The next one is gear affixes and ascendancy bonuses. So specifically, the Arcane Surge Ascendancy passive provides a 10% cast speed and 20% more mana regen. So additionally, the Arctic Armor and Clarity buff skill we have in this build, and this Arctic Armor not only provide increased mana regeneration, but also deal cold damage and freeze nearby enemies when they attack you. Arctic Armor and Clarity together grant a 30% boost to mana regeneration, making them essential for this build. So total, our mana regen should be fine with all of these setups, and anyway, you can just upgrade your mana regen amplification on your gear, of course. In total, the build requires 3 permanent active skills. As I mentioned before, 2 custom freeze setups and 1 Arctic Armor with Clarity. Achieving 160 Spirit is relatively straightforward. So 100 Spirit comes from quest rewards during the campaign, and an additional 60 can be obtained through gear like amulets and body armor, so it's pretty cheap items to achieve the 60 Spirit. If you don't have 160 Spirit yet, prioritize running just 1 custom freeze gem alongside Arctic Armor and Clarity, as mana regen is critical for this build to function smoothly. Regarding how the build works, how it freezes, triggers comets and elemental storms, you know now. Now I will explain in more detail about support skill gems and items. And let's start with the gems. First one is Elemental Storm. I use with Control Destruction because this spell anyway can't deal critical damage, so just a free 30% more damage with hits for us. Next is Persistence for more skill effect duration, because we want the boss to receive damage from each storm for a longer time, so yeah, we need it. Next is Magnified Elemental Support, which increases the storm area, helping us clear monsters and maps. And the fourth support gem here is, I don't know how to pronounce it right, but Ingenuity, I don't know, for cooldown reduction, which I mentioned earlier. By the way, for Elemental Storm, you don't need to use Javeler's Orb to add gem slots, I mean Lesser Javeler or Greater. They add themselves as the skill levels up. Next is our main freezing and boss damage skill, is Frost Wall. We use Frost Wall with Spell Cascade for an additional wall area. Next is Icicle Support, which reduces the health of Frost Walls. It's important because making them break faster and deal more damage. And Glaciation Support we use for more Freeze Buildup, to freeze enemies more often, right? Next is Fireball, which due to our glows effectively becomes Cold Ball, though it looks like fire. And we use it with Scatter Shot for 2 additional projectiles, because the more projectiles we have, the more they will bounce back and the more damage and freeze build up they will deal. That's why we also use Wild Child Support here, which grants a 20% chance to fire 8 additional projectiles in the circle. And when this 20% trigger on our Frost Walls, we get a massive amount of projectiles that fill the entire screen actually, and yeah, a bit laggy, but actually dynamic resolution works fine here. And the last one is Unleash, which allows us to use Fireball once every few seconds. I mean, we don't need to click and spam this Fireball. You should wait until you have 2 charges Unleash in this Fireball to fire 3 charges at once, meaning we get a lot of projectiles. And if wild charge triggers with our Fireball 2 Unleash charges, we get a lot of projectiles. That's, I mean, huge amounts. Next is our 2 custom Freeze Comet setups. In the first one, we use Comet with Impetus support for increased energy gain, meaning custom Freeze will fill up faster and Comets will trigger more often. We also use Inspiration support here, which reduces the cost of Comets for 1 Comet, saving us some mana, I mean for 1 custom Freeze setup. In the second custom Freeze setup, we also use Comet with Supercritical support, which grants 100% increased crit damage bonus but reduces crit hit chance, and with Concentrated Effect support just for more damage and less area, since most of our Comets will trigger on rare monsters and unique bosses, as these types feel the energy required for triggering faster. Next is our Arctic Armor buff, which we use with Clarity for increased mana regen rate, as I mentioned earlier, and also if you have Unused Spirit, like I do, you can use Cannibalism support for 4% of life recovered on kill, so it's really good for mapping. Next is Solar Orb, which we use on tanky rare monsters or bosses, and we use it with Cold Exposure support to actually inflict this exposure on critical hit and increase cold damage against enemies. And last but not least, we use the Hypothermia Curse with Heightened Curse and Expand supports for greater area and curse duration, which lowers enemies' cold resistance as well. So we have 2 debuffs in this build for the monsters. We have Cold Exposure and we have Hypothermia Curse, which will lower enemy cold resistance. We are done with skill gems right now. Hope everything was clear. But in any case, feel free to ask me questions in the comments or on my Discord channel if you have any questions about this build or just want to talk with me. Now, a quick rundown of key items in the build and what mods we need here. First of all, the wands, which should have +2 or +3 to level of all spell skills, since we have both fire and cold spells stacking these builds. Also, the next mod is gain percentage of damage as extra elemental damage. It's a very useful mod for damage and of course critical hit chance for spells. So these 3 mods on the wands are the most important, and if your budget allows, get one with increased spell damage or another extra elemental damage mod, and you'll be fine. Next is, I mentioned the shield earlier, you need exactly this one. It's cheap, so you shouldn't have any problems with it. We need it for faster elemental storm cooldown and mana regen, and the glows I also mentioned earlier, which convert all fire damage into cold. They're also very cheap. I mean, all other rare items should have like +2 maximum life, resistances, and movement speed if we're talking about boots. As for jewels on the passive skill tree, buy something with critical hit damage or chance and increased cold damage or penetration. That's pretty much everything you need by level 68 playing this build, or a bit later, like level 70. If you like my build and want me to update this guide and release a new video with this build progression, leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube, Twitch, Discord, and if you want to support Patreon. Yes, and it was Raychich as always. I really love this build. I spent a few days making this build, making this guide for you. Thank you for watching and wish you luck. Guys, goodbye.